morning. Good morning. This is a wonderful day in southern England, isn't it? Abnormally warm for this time of the year, almost scary warm. The gospel this morning has to do with baptism. It is a very familiar passage for all of us. And it concerns something that involves the entry point, the rite of passage, we say, into Christianity. And we know a little bit about the importance of rites of passage. When I was in college, I wanted to join a fraternity, and in order to do that, you had to go through a period of pledging to the fraternity. Some of you have done that with sororities as well. And it's a kind of rite of passage, and it takes different forms and endures for various longer periods of time, depending upon the type of rite of passage it is. But rites of passage are very important to the human psyche, not just in the field of religion, but also in other areas as well, even in fraternity life. And at the end of it all, you know that you're a member of that particular fraternity because you've gone through that rite of passage. And so it is in organized religion as well. Now, for Judaism, the rite of passage had to do with males only. And the rite of passage, as you know, is called circumcision. And so when Christianity came along, there needed to be some way of distancing oneself from the Jewish faith, but also becoming more inclusive at the same time as a rite of passage. We wouldn't quite be the same as Christians if we didn't have this rite of passage, which is known as baptism. And baptism itself does not mean that somehow or another we're instantly saved. It just means that we have allowed ourselves the possibility of going through a rite of passage which leads to a whole lifetime of something that the church calls, in fancy language, the process of sanctification. The process of being made aware and illuminated, step by step perhaps, and sometimes not so well, but illuminated nonetheless as to the knowledge and the splendor and the glory of God in our lives. And that's the promise of baptism. Just like the Spirit descended upon Jesus in bodily form like a dove, then also we believe in baptism that somehow or another it opens up new vistas, new panoramas for all of us. And it transforms our lives, even if we're not aware of how our lives are being transformed at the time. Are you with me so far on that? And as the church understood this, baptism became kind of the common entry point into the life of Christianity. And it molded people and shaped people slightly differently than the Jewish people were molded and shaped. For example, we spread into the Gentile world because of baptism. Not only was baptism more inclusive in the sense that it took into account both females as well as males who could be baptized, and children and adults who could be baptized, but it included perhaps even more significantly Gentiles. Anyone who wanted to be baptized, you need not claim to have Jewish heritage in order to be baptized and to begin that process of sanctification in Christianity, in Christian faith and belief. Now, as you know, for the first 300 or thereabouts years of the Christian heritage and history, there were colonies or groups of Christians who met somewhat apart from one another and came up with a way of worshiping, a way of believing, a way of interpreting what Jesus was all about. And first of all, because of communication not being as effective and as efficient back in those days as it is today. And secondly, because of persecution. The early church had in common for almost 300 years most of all a sense of baptism. The Christians in one part of the Roman Empire maybe disagreed with Christians in another part of the Roman Empire, but they all agreed that they were Christians by dint of their baptism. It was a very important and potent symbol for the people who called themselves Christians. And then the phone rang. Is that the Spirit calling? I hope the Spirit approves of what I'm saying. But baptism then kind of, in a way, became so apparent and so successful that under the reign of a Roman emperor named Constantine, Constantine ordered that all of the subjects in the Roman Empire become baptized immediately. They didn't even have any idea of the significance of baptism necessarily, but nonetheless people just clamored into Christian congregations and organizations in order to be baptized, because far from being persecuted, Christianity became the official sanctioned state religion of the entire Roman Empire. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people automatically were expected to be baptized and call themselves Christians whether they wanted to be or not. But you can see the impact of all of that. It just grew Christianity exponentially, almost overnight. Are you with me so far? If you're in one of my inquirers classes, you'll understand this at an even deeper level, because we'll go into it even more deeply. But nonetheless, for today, let's just understand that as Christianity grew, it assumed an importance, particularly in West Europe, that it simply didn't have before the time of Constantine. And as Christianity grew in Western Europe, the Roman Empire also collapsed. It collapsed of its own weight, a little bit like the Soviet Union has done in our time. And there were groups of people from outside the Roman Empire who tried to take it over, who tried to seize the lands and claim the wealth of the Roman Empire. And at that point in time, the only institution strong enough to resist the Mongols was the Bishop of Rome, who heroically apparently stood outside the gates of the city of Rome and forbade the Mongols from entering into the city of Rome. It was a very kind of dramatic event in which the church came to symbolize the values of the culture. And it took all of its values and remade the Roman Empire. Have you ever heard the expression, the Holy Roman Empire? That's how that came about. It was because it was instituted and inaugurated and was driven by the religious people in authority, particularly in the church in the West. And it became a very powerful institution, as you know. The Pope was able to garner a lot, not only of wealth, but also of influence over people for hundreds of years. And that wealth was used certainly not for the best of all of the people, but also it was used in a very constructive and helpful way to build up values and to build up a sense of community and to build up a sense of belonging in a safe place, such as a church. That's why we even today look for places of safety and security and call them sanctuaries, call them holy places. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happened at the time of the Protestant Reformation, and this particularly pertains to the church in the western part of Europe. Martin Luther came along, and as you know, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was a member of what was called the Roman Catholic Church. And yet he saw that God had an immediate effect upon people. You didn't necessarily have to go through all of the mediatorial aspects of the Pope in Rome and the Archbishop and the cardinals and all of that hierarchy, but that the individual could have a relationship with God. As you might expect, that had a rather threatening effect upon the Pope in Rome, and it led to Martin Luther's excommunication. And it led to eventually the rise of different kind of set of denominations, which we call the Protestant Church. They're protesting against the fact that the Pope was the only one who could interpret the way God operated. That somehow or another there was an immediacy about accessing God that was available to the individual under the proper circumstances. Are you with me so far? Now, what happened in England is very interesting, and it will still hinge upon the fact that even when Martin Luther started saying what he said and developed followers, and when John Calvin in Switzerland started saying what he said and developed followers, and a guy named Ulrich Zwingli started saying and doing what he said in another part of Switzerland, even though they didn't agree with one another, they still maintained this sense that baptism was the rite of passage. It's so important symbolically for all of us. And it held not only the Protestants together, but it made the Protestant reformers in the 1500s at least aware that there was something still that they had to respect about the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church didn't appreciate the Protestant reformers on the continent at the time. There was a young prince of England whose brother had become the King of England, and as a young man, he went over to the continent and did battle against the Protestant reformers, for which the Pope gave him the title, the Defender of the Faith. That man was Henry VIII. He later on became king, his brother died, and to this very day, the title of the monarch in England is the Defender of the Faith. Queen Elizabeth II is known officially as the Defender of the Faith. Now, Henry VIII had a bit of a problem in his life. He wanted a male heir, and Catherine, his wife, couldn't apparently bring him a male heir, as if it were all her fault. And Catherine happened to be the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, very staunch Catholic allies. Ferdinand and Isabella are the same couple that sponsored Christopher Columbus in his expeditions to what we know now as North America. But Ferdinand and Isabella were staunch advocates and supporters of the Pope of Roman Catholicism. And when King Henry VIII wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, it got him into big trouble with the Pope, so much so that it eventually led to his excommunication as well. And Henry VIII said, nuts to all of this, if I'm going to call myself a Christian, after all, he had been baptized, then I've got the power to start my own church, which he did. It's called the Church of England. Now, Henry VIII died, and as you know, left his empire in England to a very, very good person in terms of her savvy politically and economically. Her name was Elizabeth I, maybe the greatest monarch in the history of Western civilization. Just an absolutely brilliant person. And the way that she governed was extraordinarily wise. She wanted more than anything else for England to expand its empire beyond the borders of what we know of as the British Isles. And one of the impediments of doing that was this question of religious tension within England, and particularly with England and Ireland. And so what she did was she worked out a compromise between the Catholic side of the faith and the Protestant side of the faith. She was Catholic in the sense that she wanted the power to appoint the bishops, so that the bishops would make sure that whatever they said and whatever leadership they provided was in accord with what Queen Elizabeth I wanted. And she was willing to let the Catholic side of the Church of England used the sacraments not only including baptism, but the Holy Eucharist as well. And yet she also wanted a little bit more of a Protestant understanding of how they functioned within the Church of England. It wasn't quite so dictatorial as having the Pope in Rome. And of course, as we know, the effect of that spread not just in England, but it also spread all throughout the world, because during the reign of Elizabeth I, and certainly shortly thereafter, England as a national entity exploded, and it became much more powerful. Queen Elizabeth I's genius was she built up its navy, and the navy was able to go out on the seas, the highways of its day, and they were able to colonize places in Africa, in Asia, and in North America. And while they were in all of those countries, they established little churches that they called Anglican churches. You know, the Angles, for the Angles and the Saxons. The Anglican churches were established in countries such as Sierra Leone. Some of you are from Sierra Leone. And in other parts of the world, even as far away as Hong Kong. So what happened in the colonies, in the, what we know of today as the United States? Prior to that, the Church of England had its presence in all of the communities, and literally in this area particularly, what the Church of England did was become the local courthouse, in effect. The records were kept as to who was born, official records, who was married, and who died. That's why you'll see sometimes, perhaps not at St. Matthias, but in many other Episcopal churches in Virginia, that they have cemeteries surrounding the church. It's because you had to be buried in that cemetery if you were a legal resident. And the church was the place where the records were kept as to who was the legal resident and who was not. So there was a marriage kind of between the church and the state, and part of that marriage had to do with the Church of England's presence in the colonies being supported by tax money. So the clergy's salary, the clergy heating, the church's heating bill, everything, the cost of maintaining the building was all paid out of people's tax monies. The Revolutionary War did away with all of that. The Revolutionary War established shortly after its conclusion a sense of separation of church and state, so that there was no more an established church. And the Church of England greatly suffered as a result of that. It was good news if you couldn't be a member of the Church of England prior to the American Revolution, and after the American Revolution could freely give of your time, talent, and money to, let's just say, the Methodist Church. But if you were a member of the Church of England and wanted to continue, it was much more difficult to do so after the American Revolutionary War. And I'll tell you why. After the American Revolutionary War, people in what became the United States of America didn't want to hear that we were praying for the King of England, King George III at the time. It was almost as if we were traitors in saying prayers for King George after the American Revolution. You follow what I'm saying? Anything that even was tainted with England or the monarch in England was held as suspect in the United States. So after the American Revolutionary War, let's just say 1780 or so, everything after that meant that the Episcopal Church, which ultimately was founded, was really founded under an enormous amount of difficulty. Not only were native colonists suspect of members who would call themselves Church of England folks. But even when we tried to get the church's hierarchy on an ongoing line of continuance, the Parliament in England didn't want to do that. We sent over very qualified people, and the Parliament said, no, we're not going to make these people bishops. So the Episcopal Church was just clawing for survival after the American Revolutionary War, but they still baptized. It shows you the power of baptism. As time went by, the Episcopal Church was founded approximately 1789, and our flag, the Episcopal Church flag, which is in every Episcopal church, has 9 crosses on it. Instead of stars, like the stars and stripes on the American flag, it has 9 crosses because there were 9 original dioceses of the Episcopal Church. There are now well over 110 dioceses. But when it was founded with only 9 dioceses. The entire state of Virginia, including West Virginia, being one of those dioceses. Also, it was founded in a kind of egalitarian way, in the sense that it did have a hierarchy. They did have bishops and priests and deacons and lay people. But the decision-making engine that governed and still governs the Episcopal Church is modeled not after the monarch in England, but rather after the way the federal government has been set up, specifically the legislative part of the federal government. So there are 2 houses, one being the House of Bishops, somewhat similar to the U.S. Senate, and the other house being the House of Deputies, somewhat similar to the House of Representatives. In the House of Bishops, anybody and everybody who has been ordained a bishop is eligible to have voice, vote, and seat at this point in time. But in the House of Representatives, there are representatives from every diocese. In the first day, it was 9 dioceses, and you usually had 4 lay people and 4 priests who made up the delegation or the deputation from each diocese. And today, it still is 4 lay people and 4 priests or deacons who make up the deputation from each diocese. And they meet in something called the General Convention every 3 years. The location varies from place to place in the United States. But when they meet, they decide and vote on various issues. That is why we have things like the ordination of women that passed back, well, officially, I think, in 1979, I think. But at any rate, those are the way that things are governed in the Episcopal Church. It's a much more kind of democratic-minded body than even the Church of England is. In the Church of England, if there's a vacancy for an office of bishop, it still comes out of an appointment, actually, technically, from the monarch. We don't do that in the Episcopal Church, but we're part of this worldwide Anglican communion, and it unites us to one another as Anglicans. It's the second largest worldwide communion of Christians in the world. It's only second to the Roman Catholics. Believe it or not, we're larger on a global scale than the Southern Baptists. Now, you wouldn't know that if you just lived in this country, and particularly if you lived in the South. But we're larger than that. And of course, the explosive growth within the Anglican communion is happening not in developed countries like the United States and Canada, but rather in African and Asian countries where both Roman Catholicism and the Anglican faith is just growing by leaps and bounds. So the thing that holds us all together through all of these little dissensions, fractures, geographic divisions, etc., the thing that holds us all together is baptism. Now, baptism, I think, is very important, not just as a a symbol of unity, but it's also very important for all of us to understand as a symbol of empowerment of ministry. When I was first ordained, a long time ago, 37 years ago now, when I was first ordained, they were just beginning to talk about empowering the lay people for ministry by dint of your baptism. And there were parishes that were resistant to that. They just wanted the priest or the clergy or the bishop to do that. But now, in 37 years, I've seen a kind of miraculous turnaround where in healthy congregations, what you find is the empowerment of the laity in appropriate ways, not as a kind of control or power issue, but rather as an issue of cooperative ministry. And that brings me to the transition process that we're in. I urge you all, if possible, to stay after this worship service and to attend an open forum that will be led by Judith Carlson and Ned Armstrong, Ned being our senior warden. And Judith, would you stand? Judith is the consultant to St. Matthias for our transition process. And the members of the vestry will be seated all up on the front row. Gary, you're going to have to move those crutches. But it's an act of empowerment of the laity to make meaningful decisions in conjunction with the Spirit of the living God. And that's the kind of process and time that we find ourselves in the Episcopal Church. Finally, let me say another thing about baptism. We're struggling, I know, but we've also made great strides lately in recognizing that baptism of all believers is precisely that. The Episcopal Church years ago allowed people, for example, to receive Holy Communion who came from different Christian backgrounds, but who were baptized and therefore entitled to Holy Communion every bit as much as a baptized Episcopalian is. So we're working through all of those issues which we call ecumenism, so that we come together, as the liturgy today will say, as every tribe and language and people and nation eventually are coming together under the guidance and leadership of God. That is part, perhaps, but a part of what you're engaged in by participating in open forums, by participating in regular active membership in the church, by being a part of a community of faith. It's the power of baptism being realized, incarnated in our lives together. And it's wonderful to behold. Amen. And now let us stand.